Number 1. As one approaches some crossroads, one comes to a sign which says that drivers have to stop when they come to the main road ahead. At other crossroads, drivers have to go slow, but they do not actually have to stop, unless, of course, there is something coming along the main road. And at still others, they do not have either to stop or to go slow, because they are themselves on the main road. Mr. Williams, who was always a very careful driver, was driving home from work one evening when he came to a crossroads. It had a slow sign, so he slowed down when he came to the main road, looked both ways to see that nothing was coming, and then drove across without stopping completely. At once he heard a police whistle, so he pulled in to the side of the road and stopped. A policeman walked over to him with a notebook and pencil in his hand and said, "You didn't stop at that crossing." "But the sign there doesn't say stop," answered Mr. Williams. "It just says slow, and I did go slow." The policeman looked around him, and a look of surprise came over his face. Then he put his notebook and pencil away, scratched his head and said, "Well, I'll be blowed. I am in the wrong street."
Number 2. Before the last war, officers in the Navy had a lot more freedom when their ship was in port than they have nowadays. They were expected to lead a busy social life and to take an active part in sport ashore. It was therefore rather difficult for them to find time to do all their other duties. Usually, all the officers in a ship used to have a regular meeting together once a week to receive orders from their captain, make reports, and discuss any business that had to be discussed, such as who should represent the ship in the next football match. One such meeting was being held on board a ship one day, and after the regular business had been completed, the time came to discuss the date of the next meeting. Friday of the next week was suggested, and so was Monday of the week after, but both of them interfered with somebody's arrangements for the weekend, and in the end it was generally agreed that the meeting should be held on Wednesday, as this would be the least likely day to interfere with anybody's convenience, since it was right in the middle of the week. As the officers were leaving, however, one of them was heard to say, "Wednesday is the worst day, because it interferes with 2 weekends."
Number 3. Mr. and Mrs. Williams had always spent their summer holidays in England in the past, in a small boarding house at the seaside. One year, however, Mr. Williams made a lot of money in his business, so they decided to go to Rome and stay at a really good hotel while they went around and saw the sights of that famous city. They flew to Rome and arrived at their hotel late one evening. They expected that they would have to go to bed hungry, because in the boarding houses they'd been used to in the past, no meals were served after 7 o'clock in the evening. They were therefore surprised when the clerk who received them in the hall of the hotel asked them whether they would be taking dinner there that night. "Are you still serving dinner, then?" asked Mrs. Williams. "Yes, certainly, madam," answered the clerk. "We serve it until 9:30. "What are the times of meals, then?" asked Mr. Williams. "Well, sir," answered the clerk, "we serve breakfast from 7 to 11:30 in the morning, lunch from 12 to 3 in the afternoon, tea from 4 to 5, and dinner from 6 to 9:30. "But that hardly leaves any time for us to see the sights of Rome," said Mrs. Williams in a disappointed voice.
Number 4. Mrs. Black was having a lot of trouble with her skin, so she went to her doctor about it. He He couldn't find anything wrong with her, however, so he sent her to the local hospital for some tests. The hospital, of course, sent the results of the tests direct to Mrs. Black's doctor, and the next morning he telephoned her to give her a list of the things that he thought she shouldn't eat, as any of them might be the cause of her skin trouble. Mrs. Black carefully wrote all the things down on a piece of paper, which she then left beside the telephone while she went out to a ladies' meeting. When she got back home 2 hours later, she found her husband waiting for her. He had a big basket full of packages beside him, and when he saw her, he said, "Hello, dear, I've done all your shopping for you." "Done all my shopping?" she asked in surprise. "But how did you know what I wanted?" "Well, when I got home, I found your shopping list beside the telephone," answered her husband. "So I went down to the shops and bought everything you'd written down." Of course, Mrs. Black had to tell him that he'd bought all the things the doctor didn't allow her to eat.
Number 5. Some young soldiers who had recently joined the army were being trained in modern ways of fighting, and one of the things they were shown was how an unarmed man could trick an armed enemy and take his weapon away from him. First, one of their 2 instructors took a knife away from the other, using only his bare hands, and then he took a rifle away from him in the same way. After the lesson, and before they went on to train the young soldiers to do these things themselves, the 2 instructors asked them a number of questions to see how well they had understood what they had been shown. One of the questions was this: "Well, you now know what an unarmed man can do against a man with a rifle. Imagine that you are guarding a bridge at night, and that you have a rifle. Suddenly, you see an unarmed enemy soldier coming towards you. What will you do?" The young soldier who had to answer this question thought carefully for a few seconds before he answered, and then said, "Well, after what I have just seen, I think that the first thing I would do would be to get rid of my rifle as quickly as I could, so that the unarmed enemy soldier couldn't take it from me and kill me with it."
Number 6. A certain poet had written a play, and arrangements were being made to perform it. Of course, the poet was asked to give his advice on the scenery, the lighting, and all the other things that helped to make a play successful, and he proved to be a very difficult man to please, as he had his own very definite ideas of how each scene should look. In one of the scenes in the play, it was necessary to produce the effect of a wonderful sunset, which the young lovers watched together before singing one of their great love songs. The theatre electricians worked very hard to produce this sunset effect. They tried out all kinds of arrangements and combinations of lights: red lights, orange lights, yellow lights, blue lights, lights from above, lights from behind, lights from the front, lights from the sides. But nothing satisfied the poet until suddenly he saw exactly the effect that he'd been dreaming of producing ever since he'd written his play. "That's it!" he shouted excitedly to the electricians behind the stage. "That's just right! Keep it exactly like that!" "I'm sorry, sir," answered the chief electrician, "but we can't keep it like this." "Why ever not?" asked the poet angrily. "Because the theatre's on fire, sir," answered the chief electrician. "That's what's producing the effect you can see now."
Number 7. Nasruddin never seemed to have enough money to pay his bills, so he always owed money to the shopkeepers in his town. Most of them were patient, understanding men, and didn't speak to him very often about the money that he owed them. But there was one who was not at all patient, and who was also very fond of money. Whenever this man saw Nasruddin, he reminded him of the money that he hadn't yet paid him, and he very often did this in front of Nasruddin's best friends, which made Nasruddin feel very uncomfortable, as he didn't want his friends to know that he was so poor. One day, therefore, Nasruddin decided to teach the shopkeeper a lesson. The next time that the man stopped him in the street and began to shame him publicly about his debt to him, Nasruddin said, "Wait a minute, how much money do I in fact owe you?" "You owe me exactly 122 liras, answered the shopkeeper. "Well," said Nasruddin, "if I paid you 40 liras this month, another 40 next month, and 40 more the month after that, how much would I still owe you?" "You would then owe me 2 liras, of course," answered the shopkeeper. "Well, aren't you ashamed of yourself," Nasruddin said, "giving me all this trouble for only 2 liras?"
Number 8. Mrs. Baker's sister was ill. She had someone to look after her from Monday to Friday, but not at the weekend. So every Friday evening Mrs. Baker used to go off to spend the weekend with her at her home in a neighbouring town. But as Mr. Baker couldn't cook, she had arranged for his sister to come over and spend the weekend looking after him at their home. This meant that Mr. Baker had quite a busy time when he came home from work on Friday evenings. First, he had to drive home from the railway station. Then he had to drive his wife to the station to catch her train. And then he had to wait until his sister's train arrived so as to take her to his house. Of course, on Sunday evening he had to drive his sister to the station to catch her train back home, and then wait for his wife's train so as to bring her home. One Sunday evening he'd seen his sister off on her train and was waiting for his wife's arrival when a porter, who had often seen him at the station, came over and spoke to him. "You're having a lot of fun," he said, "but one day one of those women is going to catch you with the other, and then you'll be in real trouble."
Number 9. A gay young man who earned his living as a drummer in a band had just married, and he and his wife were looking for somewhere to live. They saw a lot of places, but there was always something that one of them did not like about them. At last, however, they found a block of new flats which both of them really liked. However, there was still the problem of whether they should take one of the ground floor flats, which had a small garden, or one of the upstairs ones. At last they decided on a first floor flat, not too low down and not too high up, and moved in. After they had bought furniture, carpets, curtains, and all the rest, they gave a big party to celebrate the setting up of their first home together. It was a gay and noisy party, as all the host's friends from the band came and played their instruments. The guests danced, sang, and practiced on their host's drums. Soon after 1 a.m. the telephone rang. The hostess went to answer it in the hall, and after she had finished, came back with a happy smile on her face and said to her husband, "That was the man who has just moved into the flat downstairs telephoning, dear. I am so glad we decided not to choose it. He says it's terribly noisy down there."
Number 10. Just after the last war, people were very willing to give money to help those who had suffered from it. But not everyone who collected money was honest. The newspapers were full of stories of people who had been cheated by men who went from house to house saying that they were collecting for soldiers who had been seriously wounded in the war, or for people who had lost their homes, or for some other noble cause. while all the time they were putting the money they collected into their own pockets, instead of using it for the purposes they claimed to be collecting it for. One day, Mr. Smith came back with another story of this kind. He told his wife that a group of people had collected thousands of dollars for the widow of the unknown soldier. Then someone had written to the papers about it, and they had written articles to warn other people. Mr. Smith said that he and his friends at the office had had a good laugh about the story when they had read it in the newspaper. "Can you imagine anyone being so stupid as to believe that story and give money for the widow of the unknown soldier?" he asked his wife. She looked puzzled at first, but then her face brightened. "Oh, yes, I see now," she answered. "Of course, the government pays the widow of the unknown soldier."